I remember as a child, my parents always hated when I cried. Crying has an unusual meaning, and there are rules in the air which tells everyone when you can cry. Little children and babies, for instance, can cry for anything, and also for necessities like food, water, and even relieving boredom. As you grow into an adult, you learn that what you cried for as a child, you must now refrain from and resist against the temptation. As an adult, the luxury you had when crying whenever you want now turns into a rare tool you can only use in certain situations. Situations like losing someone or being in extreme pain, either physical or emotional, can be seen as okay for crying. But crying can be joyful, like when a son marries or your daughter graduates. I was taught, though, to never cry, and this teaching affected my adult life because my parents were too extreme with this rule that even when I see anyone crying, even for good reasons, they disgust me. Crying will get you nowhere, my father used to say to me, and my mother used to shout at me if tears went down my face. I live alone now in my own new flat, which I had recently moved into, which was a year ago, and I moved to be closer to a construction job. The first thing I noticed as I was just viewing the flat before I rented it was the crying. I could hear people crying in their flats, and not just one, but many. I ignored it, and I liked the flat I viewed, so I decided to rent it. I didn't have much of a choice anyhow, whether I liked it or not didn't matter, because it was the closest flat to my new job. I have lived there for a year now, and every day that year I could hear people crying. And the weirdest thing is that it's always a group of people. I hate the sound of crying, and you know that sobbing sound people make when they are crying hard? It makes me feel uneasy. I started to notice different variations of crying within the building of flats. Some people's crying were soft, loud, hard, mild, and some even joyful. Then I realized something, and that ever since I had moved into my flat, I had never once heard a word coming out of other people's mouths living in these flats, except crying and sobbing sounds. One guy even waves at me every day as he is crying joyfully, but then I noticed that the way he was crying was actually the way he communicated to me. When he was sobbing happily at me with a smile, he could have been saying something like hello or good morning. Then I started thinking about when other tenants within the building are crying together, and all will be crying differently with different level of sound. They too could be having a social interaction, which I mistook just for crying. I observed them a bit more, and the more I observed them, the more I became really positive that my thinking was spot on. These people, my neighbors, these tenants, they actually communicated with each other in the form of crying. Now, even though I hate crying, I have this weird ability or talent, whatever you want to call it, to just cry on the spot without any reason. I should have become an actor, I guess. Anyway, I started to get really tempted to just cry on the spot for no reason when I would find a group of tenants just crying. I could just pretend that I know what they are saying and pretend to enjoy the social interaction of crying with them. So when I spotted a group of tenants on my floor all crying, some had smiley faces, sad faces, grumpy faces, and all sobbing differently, I decided that this was my shot. I got next to them and started to cry on the spot, and I could just see a flashback of my parents shouting at me as a child for crying. Then all of a sudden, after a couple of minutes of pretend crying, the group of tenants all crying before were now staring at me. They weren't crying, but just staring at me, and I had never seen them to just not cry, and I didn't like it. One of them started crying at me with a confused look on his face, and then another person started angrily crying at me in a furious tone. Then all of them started crying angrily at me, and I must have offended them or something because I don't know what I had just said, but I must have set them off. Ever since then, I have been followed around by other tenants, all crying at me angrily and mysteriously as if they were planning to do something to me in an act of revenge. I have even had my flat door vandalized. I could hear quiet crying whenever I would get out of my flat, as if they were speaking and conversing quietly about me. I hope I can survive this, and I really don't know what I had just said to them to make them so angry at me. Even the man who used to joyfully cry at me every morning now just stares at me with a few tears rolling down his face.